This week at Starbase, while the various construction projects continue at the usual rapid pace, crews begin scrapping Booster 17, test article B18.1 undergoes another round of cryo testing, and the Pad 1 launch mount practically disappears right before our eyes. While SpaceX is known for their rapid pace of production, just how fast do we think the demolition work at Pad 1 could possibly be? Let's dig into this week's update and find out. Starting off this week, Starship 39.1, a test tank for Block 3 engineering validation, was brought out of Megabay 2 and taken back into the Star Factory. Megabay 2's door was opened again the next day, revealing that Starship 39 is now on the middle work stand, still waiting on its aft dome, with the rest of the ship resting on wood blocks. A newly made nose cone lifting jig was brought into Star Factory to accelerate ship production work. And inside the factory, Starship 40's nose cone was stacked onto its payload bay section, bringing the second Block 3 ship another step closer to completion. The protective weather cap was removed from Booster 17 in the rocket garden for what was a planned move to Megabay 1, but workers then began moving the booster toward Megabay 1 for disassembly and suddenly seemed to realize that they didn't actually have any room inside for it. Perhaps they just needed to clear some space inside the garden, but the booster ended up being moved back after a while. It was then shuffled back and forth several times while crews either tried to decide where to put it or what needed to be cleaned out. Eventually, they found a space near the garden and set the booster down to begin further disassembly work. The rocket garden crew began disassembling the chine covers, exposing the booster's subsystems and fire suppression COPVs underneath. Back at the site of Pad 1, after wrapping up removal of the outer armor from the orbital launch mount, demolition crews moved on to the inner part of the top half of the original ring. Each section was sliced apart with plasma lances before being hoisted out by crane until the launch table was bisected and the internals were taken away. With most of the upper half of the table removed, workers then began lancing through the lower ring supports and the rest of the structures that bridge the launch mount legs. Some of the cut-up segments were lifted out, while others would be dropped onto dirt padding on the ground below. The cable chain used to anchor and carry the chopstick's electrical systems was also removed from Tower 1, as work continues to remove the legacy systems from the pad. Amid all that demolition work, construction work on Pad 2 continued with the arrival of both of the pad's booster quick disconnect covers. Before those covers were installed, the new clamp arm test structure was lifted, rotated, and then lowered into a new position to begin testing on the next set of arms. The liquid oxygen cover was the first of the two to be put in place, completing the armored housing that protects the booster's lock side ground systems during launch, and about 24 hours later, the cover for the methane quick disconnect was also lifted and installed. Inside Megabay 2, composite deck sheets for a new access platform under construction in the right front corner of the bay were lifted into place. Meanwhile, the Gigabay continues to rise. Multiple steel beams are being lifted at the same time and were slotted sequentially into place while iron workers bolt each piece together. On Friday, the old engine access platforms were removed from one of the Megabay 2 workstations and placed in the building's doorway. New replacement platforms were soon brought over and installed in their place. Moving on from all that construction and deconstruction, let's talk a little bit about testing. Back down at the launch site, qualification work on Pad 2's various systems was carried out this week. The methane side of the ground support equipment bunker was purged, cleaning out any remaining foreign object debris that might be inside. The new pad's deluge system was also tested a few times as water sprayed into the air and into the flame trench. The Starship cryogenic test stand, loaded with hydraulic rams to simulate engine flight loads, arrived at the build site after heading out from the Massey Outpost early on Thursday morning. On Friday, the stabilizer arms on the Pad 2 chopsticks underwent some actuation testing as the clamp arm tester dubbed ibuprofen was rotated to yet another set of clamp arms. Over at the Massey Outpost, the Booster 18.3 test tank underwent another round of testing as the Block 3 booster verification process continues. The westernmost tower crane had some trouble at the construction site, spinning around for several hours. This ended up happening again a bit later. Now, while these cranes are designed to weather vane in the wind, they are not designed to keep spinning around like that. I'm honestly not sure what went wrong here, so let me know what you think in the comments. Well, you know what comes next. Moving on to our Falcon 9 operations, this week in Cape Canaveral saw the launch of the Starlink Group 10-51 mission on Falcon 9 booster 1069, lifting off from Launch Complex 39A with another batch of SpaceX's telecommunication satellites before landing downrange on a shortfall of gravitas. The barge and booster were successfully brought back to port and unloaded at the dockside stand for stowage before being sent back to Roberts Road for refurbishment. Starlink Group 6-87 was the second Falcon 9 launch this week, with preparations beginning 2 days in advance. Just read the instructions, headed out to sea, joined by Bob to catch the booster and the fairings. Falcon 9 booster 1096 lifted off from Slick 40 for its third flight, carrying 29 satellites into space before landing and returning to the coast. Both the booster and fairing halves were successfully recovered after the flight and unloaded at the Port Canaveral docks. SpaceX ended the week with a doubleheader from Florida, as first the Starlink Group 6-89 mission lifted off from historic LC-39A on booster 1092, carrying another 29 satellites to orbit. Then, about 3.5 hours later, booster 1078 blasted off from Slick 40, also carrying 29 satellites to join the Starlink constellation. In other space news this week, Blue Origin's second New Glenn launch vehicle was raised vertical ahead of its first daytime launch, scheduled for the next day. However, various range issues, including a wayward yacht, a cruise ship, and even solar storms, ended up delaying the launch by a few days. Ultimately, after 4 days of delay, the rocket lifted off from Launch Complex 36, slowly climbing into the sky with the Escapade mission for NASA. Following a successful first stage ascent under the power of 7 BE-4 engines, the second stage separated and ignited, followed shortly by payload-fairing jettison. After staging, the booster, aptly nicknamed Never Tell Me the Odds, performed a re-entry burn, slowing down enough to descend for its landing burn. It came down 200 meters to the side of the landing ship Jacqueline, and then translated over to the deck and performed New Glenn's first successful soft landing. And if that sounds insane, that's because it kinda was. As if that wasn't exciting enough, following the second stage burns, the Escapade spacecraft successfully separated from the rocket. This is a pair of Rocket Lab built satellites that will investigate Mars's magnetosphere over the course of about 11 months, but for about the next year, they will loiter near Earth's L2 Lagrange point before heading to Mars when the transfer window opens in November of 2026. Now, switching over to our Artemis program news, NASA is continuing its acceptance testing of the engines for the 5th launch of the Space Launch System rocket, firing the second of that vehicle's 4 RS-25 engines at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. Also, Airbus has shipped the 4th European service module, which will propel the Orion spacecraft in lunar orbit on Artemis 4. And rounding out our news from the Artemis program this week, NASA released new photos of the fully stacked Artemis II launch vehicle inside the vehicle assembly building. Scheduled to fly in early 2026, this will be the first mission to send crew to lunar orbit since the 1970s. Rocket Lab released their third quarter 2025 earnings report, where they detailed revenues and ongoing plans for their shareholders and investors. The company highlighted their growing revenue and backlog of Electron rockets, as well as the ongoing work to bring their Neutron rocket into service. This partially reusable 2-stage-to-orbit rocket will be brought to their Wallops launch site for its first flight no earlier than the first quarter of 2026. Tory Bruno, the CEO of the United Launch Alliance, shared some new images of their stock of BE-4 engines supplied to them by Blue Origin. Inside the discussion thread on X, he also mentioned that 30 Vulcan rockets are currently in various stages of production. Also from ULA this week, lifting off from Slick 41, the ViaSat-3 F2 satellite was successfully launched on the Atlas V 551 rocket, heading to geostationary orbit to provide high-bandwidth communications over the Americas. Relativity Space released their October monthly highlight for their Terran-R development program. The month's highlights include progress on component-level critical design reviews, Stage 2 downcomer installation, expansion of their machine shop for 3D printed components and friction stir-welded structures, and other equipment that will expand their production capacity to flight scale. They've also completed the first round of acceptance testing for their Stage 1 flight engine, while work continues on the A2 test stand at Stennis. At Launch Complex 16 in Cape Canaveral, work continues on their horizontal integration facility, fuel farm support infrastructure, and water tower. Relativity also announced that they will be launching satellites for space solutions company SES aboard Terran R rockets once they enter service. Vast Space announced a cooperative agreement with the government of Uzbekistan's Ministry of Digital Technologies to explore human spaceflight operations in low Earth orbit aboard their upcoming Haven 1 space station. Firefly released an update on the Alpha Flight 7 first stage, announcing that they have uncovered the root cause of the ground test event that occurred at the end of September. During vehicle integration, the engine combustion chamber was contaminated with stray hydrocarbons, which resulted in a vehicle fire and explosion. Moving forward, corrective actions have been implemented, and another Alpha vehicle has been taken from the manufacturing line to perform their next mission. The Canadian Space Agency have awarded Nordspace a $1 million Canadian Space Technology Development Project grant to continue developing additive manufacturing technology for liquid-fueled rocket engines. Lockheed Martin shared images from a recent burst test of a full-scale coreless airlock-class inflatable space station module, which achieved a safety factor of 14.7, reaching 224 psi before failure. Sierra Space have made additional progress on pre-flight testing of their Dream Chaser spacecraft, verifying the landing gear's runway performance by pulling it across the tarmac. They also completed electromagnetic compatibility testing, verifying that the spacecraft's electronics are ready to operate in space. Amazon has announced this week that Project Kuiper, their low Earth orbit telecommunications satellite network, is being renamed to Amazon LEO. And finally for this week, construction work at Launch Complex 39A's Starship complex continues, with the lower section of the liquid oxygen booster quick disconnect box being lifted into place on the launch mount. As always, it was another exciting week here in the world of spaceflight, and as always, we here at LabPadre were here to cover it. If you want to make sure you don't miss out on another week, click all those fancy schmancy buttons down there and stay tuned. Thank you to all of our supporters, and until next time, this is Kaden from LabPadre, signing off.